Have you ever asked yourself if you're really living your life or just playing a role the crowd chose for you? Søren Kierkegaard believed that most people live half asleep. They get lost in the noise of the crowd, run from the anxiety of being authentic, and die without ever truly becoming someone. In this moment of silence and reflection, we invite you to step into the philosophy of authenticity, a lonely but necessary journey, where the greatest challenge isn't to understand the world, but to finally awaken to yourself. Take a deep breath, allow yourself to slow down, and listen. Because maybe, for the first time, you're about to hear the voice of your true self. The crowd is the lie. Kierkegaard. At first glance, this statement might sound like an exaggeration, but if we look at it calmly and with courage, it's actually a brutal wake-up call to be authentic. It's Kierkegaard exposing the way we often live numb, hiding behind the majority, the trends, the ordinary. To Kierkegaard, the crowd is the place where the individual disappears, where truth loses its face and responsibility vanishes like smoke. And that's why he says the crowd is the lie, because it allows us to lie to ourselves. How many times have you felt like you were just going along with the flow, even though deep down you knew it wasn't really you? How many times have you stayed quiet or held back from doing what you believe in just because nobody else was doing it? The crowd here isn't just a bunch of people. It's a kind of mindset, a collective state of consciousness that strips away personal identity. It's the symbolic place where no one takes full responsibility because everyone is just doing what's normal or what seems right. But Kierkegaard reminds us, when everyone is responsible, then no one is. And when no one takes responsibility, truth dies. Imagine a group committing some injustice. When someone asks, who was to blame? They all say, it was the group. But the group has no face, no soul, no conscience. The crowd acts without needing to explain itself. It protects those who hide inside it. And that's dangerous. The Danish philosopher wrote, "The sickness unto death," to show how a person becomes spiritually sick when they lose contact with their true self. And one of the biggest causes of that loss is exactly what the crowd offers: a place to hide. It's comfortable, it's easy, but it's a betrayal. When someone is in a group, they don't have to be themselves. They just have to be one more. Assisen, paraphrasing Kierkegaard. And that's where the lie begins. The problem with the crowd is that it creates an illusion of morality. Because if everyone is doing it, then it must be right. Right? Wrong. The morality of the majority is not always the morality of truth. And Kierkegaard goes even further. Most of the time, the crowd doesn't even have real morality. It just has habits, conventions, repetition. A person who lives by what the group does stops thinking deeply, stops questioning, and stops feeling the anxiety of real choice. They stop being authentic. They become a social ghost. Have you ever felt that emptiness, being surrounded by people, but still feeling disconnected from yourself? That's exactly what Kierkegaard was warning about. The lie of the crowd isn't just political or social, it's existential. It's the denial of our deepest duty, to be who we truly are, with courage, even when it hurts. No one is responsible, but everyone suffers. The crowd doesn't ask anything from you, and that might sound like freedom. But that lack of demand also means a lack of meaning, because real meaning only exists when there's personal responsibility, when the self steps forward and chooses to act, not just watch. Kierkegaard shows us that when people hide in the crowd, they avoid the anxiety of making real choices. But by avoiding that anxiety, they also avoid freedom. And without freedom, life becomes a loop, routine, appearance, a lie. The crowd teaches us to live on autopilot. It doesn't want you to think too much, feel too much, or desire too much. It just wants you to follow the rules, buy in, and fit in, to be one more and nothing more. But the cost is high. You stop being you. Truth is lonely. And that's why it's real. For Kierkegaard, the path to authenticity doesn't go through the crowd. It goes through solitude, reflection, and the pain of facing yourself as a separate being, a unique self before God and the world. The crowd is the lie because it erases individuality. It suffocates the spirit, and without spirit, all that's left is the visible, roles, appearances, functions. But we are more than that. Become who you are. And that's the radical demand of existence, echoed by both Kierkegaard and later Nietzsche. To Kierkegaard, this means breaking away from the collective lie. It means facing the discomfort of being different, of being misunderstood. Truth isn't democratic, it's personal. It demands courage, solitude, and silence. And that's why the crowd can't stand it. Truth exposes the fakeness of those who hide in numbers. Are we living in the age of the crowd? Even though Kierkegaard wrote in the 1800s, his warning feels like it was written for today. Social media, public opinion, trends, cancel culture, it all feeds the logic of the crowd, the logic of numbers, the logic of everyone's doing it. Maybe that's why so many people feel sick, disconnected, lost behind avatars, masks, and posts. How often do you find yourself doing something not because you want to, but because you feel like it's what's expected? How many times have you stayed silent just to avoid upsetting the crowd? Kierkegaard is calling us to wake up, to step out of the masses, to rediscover our inner voice, our individual conscience, and the non-transferable responsibility of living with truth. Are you living as an individual or hiding in the crowd? That's the question Kierkegaard throws at us like a stone shattering the mirror. He doesn't give easy answers. He doesn't offer shortcuts, but he shows this clearly. The crowd is the lie, and only personal responsibility can bring us back to the truth. So, here's an invitation. Stop for a moment. Be honest with yourself. What in you is still truly yours, and what has already been taken by the crowd? Imagine waking up every day, living, working, smiling, posting, talking, and still feeling like you're no one. Living, but not living as you. Breathing, but with a borrowed identity. Acting, but only by following the movement of the herd. That's the picture of modern despair, according to Søren Kierkegaard. The greatest danger, the most deadly of all, is losing yourself. The sickness unto death. For Kierkegaard, the worst thing isn't poverty, pain, or failure. The real tragedy is losing your sense of self, a slow, quiet, almost invisible fading of who you truly are. And it happens the moment a person dissolves into the herd, giving up their inner life to live by the standards of the outer world. This herd doesn't have to be a literal crowd. It can be the voice that says, everyone thinks like this, everyone does this, this is just how life works. The herd is made up of expectations, traditions, and social norms that don't require thought. It's where it's easier to hide than to be found. Kierkegaard wasn't talking about dramatic, obvious despair. He spoke of a deeper kind, often hidden behind what looks like a normal, even successful life. A stable job, a committed relationship, a calendar full of plans. But deep down, the person knows, or at least senses, that something is off. That there's a hollow space no amount of outside validation can fill. This is the despair of being nobody. A person who lives from the outside in, not the inside out. Who shapes themselves into what others expect, what society rewards, what's easiest. Someone who never stops to ask, what actually matters to me? And that's where Kierkegaard's philosophy hits hard, because he's not just talking about making bad choices. He's talking about an inauthentic life, a daily betrayal of who you really are. Despair is the sickness of not wanting to be yourself, the sickness unto death. And the worst part, most people don't even realize they're in despair. They get used to it. They learn to live a life that isn't theirs, filled with habits they never question and dreams they might not even want. So why do we hide in the herd? Because it feels safe, it's easier, it's less risky. When you do what everyone else does, you don't have to explain yourself. No one judges you. You're protected by the shield of normal. But Kierkegaard warns that safety is an illusion. The price of avoiding the anxiety of choice is too high. It costs you your own identity. The herd offers surface-level peace, but steals the deeper kind that only comes from living as your true self. To be the self you truly are requires effort, pain, and solitude. Kierkegaard. Being yourself is the hardest path, but it's the only real one. Every other path leads straight to despair. We live in a time where the herd has names, colors, and algorithms. It's called public opinion, social media, trends, image culture, likes, views. We're pushed to build an identity that pleases others, that fits in, that's marketable. And so the self stops being lived and starts being performed. We become characters in our own stories. Kierkegaard saw this coming with stunning clarity. He knew that when you live only through the eyes of others, you lose sight of yourself. And if you live only to please the herd, you're constantly reshaping your essence to match what the crowd wants. But the crowd changes. Tastes change. Rules change. And so you live in constant anxiety, trying to be something that's never stable, never whole, never true. And what about you? Are you building who you are, or just trying to be liked? The most powerful part of Kierkegaard's philosophy is this. Being yourself doesn't just happen. It's not automatic. It's a task, a battle, a choice. You have to choose to be who you are. You have to stand up to the world, and even more, to yourself. This is what Kierkegaard called becoming a self. But why is that so hard? Because authenticity forces you to face anxiety. And for Kierkegaard, anxiety is the price of freedom. When you accept that you're free to choose, you also accept that you might mess up, that you have no excuses, that you can't blame the herd anymore. And that hurts. But it's only in that pain that real life begins. The true self doesn't emerge in comfort. It appears in the struggle between what the world expects of you and what your soul actually wants to live. Kierkegaard reminds us of something we often forget. To hear yourself, you have to step away from the noise, from the endless chatter of outside opinions, from the automatic flow of the herd. The crowd shouts, but the true self whispers. That's why he recommends retreat, existential solitude, not as isolation, but as the only way to find your voice again. Only in silence can you finally hear yourself, and maybe, for the first time, discover what you really think, feel, and long for. Becoming yourself is both a gift and a task. Kierkegaard. Most people run from that task, but you don't have to be one of them. You can break the cycle. You can leave the herd and return to yourself. You can stop being a nobody and finally start becoming someone real. There's something subtle but deeply destructive in the way we avoid choosing. In the way we convince ourselves it's better to wait a little longer, go with the flow, do what everyone else does. But this waiting isn't neutral. It comes at a real existential cost. For Søren Kierkegaard, this refusal to decide is really a refusal to take responsibility for ourselves. To live without making authentic choices is to live in disguise, a way of existing where the person gives up their own freedom for the sake of comfort. They keep breathing, working, interacting, but inside they're not present. They're refusing to be the author of their own life. The greatest danger is not making a mistake. The greatest danger is not wanting to be yourself. Kierkegaard. This refusal, according to the Danish philosopher, is the core of modern despair. When someone avoids deciding, when they refuse to choose seriously, they're also avoiding responsibility for their existence, and with it, their own freedom. Choosing isn't just picking between two options. For Kierkegaard, a real choice goes deeper. It means committing to who you are. To decide in this sense isn't just to act, It's to affirm a way of being, and that brings anxiety. Anxiety, he says, is the dizziness of freedom. When faced with endless possibilities, we realize we're completely alone. No one else can live for us. Choosing one path means letting go of all the others. That's terrifying, and that's why so many people run. How? Simple. By adopting ready-made rules, beliefs, and lives. They copy what others do. Instead of deciding, they repeat. Instead of facing the pain of choosing, they numb themselves with routine. They live on autopilot. But Kierkegaard warns, running away doesn't free us from responsibility. It only fools us for a while. Sooner or later, anxiety comes back, disguised as emptiness, boredom, frustration, or a quiet kind of despair. Anxiety is the school of freedom. The concept of anxiety. Those who run from anxiety are also running from themselves, because there's no authenticity without going through it. One of the most common ways we run is through what Kierkegaard calls the crowd. Living according to others, following the group, is a way to avoid personal responsibility. When everyone does it, no one feels guilty. Responsibility gets blurred, consciousness gets dull. The crowd offers a toxic kind of comfort. It doesn't demand authenticity, only conformity. It doesn't ask you to think, just to copy. And that's why, for Kierkegaard, living by the crowd is a quiet betrayal of the self. This behavior is so common that many people go through life without ever making a truly personal choice. They follow paths others laid out. The right college, the stable job, the normal life. But they never ask if any of that actually connects with who they are inside. The result? A life that's busy, but meaningless. An existence that functions, but doesn't feel real. This question shows up powerfully in Fear and Trembling, one of Kierkegaard's most intense works. There he reflects on the figure of Abraham, who, when called by God to sacrifice his son, faces the most extreme kind of decision. Abraham acts out of faith, and that faith isn't blind or irrational. It's lonely, painful, deeply personal. Abraham doesn't hide behind the crowd. He doesn't ask for public approval. He doesn't wonder what everyone else would do. He makes his decision before God, alone. That's what Kierkegaard calls a knight of faith. Someone who dares to live by a truth that can't be explained to others. Someone who takes the risk of living with integrity. This image sharply contrasts with the average person, who always prefers the path that's approved, accepted, socially safe. But it's in that comfort where the soul quietly dies. One of the biggest problems in our time is existential procrastination. We live like we have infinite time, like we can always put off the decisions that really matter. But Kierkegaard reminds us, existence is urgent. Every delay is a surrender. Every avoided choice is a piece of life that never returns. And don't be fooled, not choosing is a choice. When you avoid deciding, you're choosing to live by other people's expectations. When you avoid action, you're letting inertia make your decisions. When you avoid responsibility, you're handing over your freedom to the crowd. Become who you are. No Kierkegaard. That's the core ethical challenge, but it's not light. It's not easy. It means pain, solitude, doubt. It means taking ownership of your existence with no guarantees, no step-by-step plan. If running from responsibility leads to despair, then owning it is the path to freedom. That doesn't mean you'll have all the answers. It means you'll have the courage to live the questions, to stay with the anxiety, to stand as a real person in front of your own life. Taking responsibility means saying, I am the author of my life, and even if I don't control everything, I commit to who I am, to what I choose, and to what I do. That's the beginning of true freedom. Not the freedom to do anything, but the freedom to be who you really are, and not just a reflection of the world around you. What happens to a person when they stop being someone and become just one more in the crowd? When their name no longer matters, their story is ignored, and their existence is reduced to a number, a role, a statistic. For Kierkegaard, this is one of the greatest dangers of modern life: anonymity as a form of dehumanization, a way of living where the individual loses their face, their inner life, and becomes just another part in the social machine. A life where nobody is anybody and everyone is equally absent from themselves. Anonymity might feel comfortable, and in some ways, it is. Hiding in the crowd protects us from judgment, from being seen, from responsibility. It's easier to be just another person in the group than to be a real individual in the world. But Kierkegaard warns us that kind of comfort strips us of our humanity, because a life that isn't personal isn't really lived. When we live only through social roles, the student, the employee, the voter, the consumer, we become characters in a script, not real people. The problem isn't the role itself, but when it takes over your entire identity, when the real you disappears behind the mask, when you become what others expect instead of who you truly are. The loss of the self doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, every time we refuse to be who we are. Schell paraphrased from Kierkegaard. It's this gradual, quiet loss that he calls despair, a kind of despair we often don't even notice, because we've gotten used to living without a face. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard says despair is a sickness of the spirit. But he also recognizes that this sickness has social roots. One of them is what he calls the culture of quantity. In a world where everything is measured in numbers, followers, views, data, statistics, people start to see themselves as numbers too. Your worth is what you produce. You matter only if you're seen. And if no one sees you, it's like you don't exist. Anonymity here isn't about quiet humility. It's about losing your symbolic existence. Feeling like, if you're not visible, you have no value. Kierkegaard saw this danger long before the digital age. In his criticism of the press and public opinion, he pointed to the way society flattens everyone into sameness. Today, his warnings seem even more urgent. We live in a time where anonymity is paradoxical. We're constantly connected, yet we feel completely invisible as individuals. We see everything, but we're rarely seen ourselves, not as real people, but as profiles, likes, and data points. Anonymity also kills responsibility. Kierkegaard insists on this. When someone doesn't own their identity, when they don't face themselves, others, or God as a self, they lose their humanity. They dissolve into the crowd. And as we've seen, the crowd answers for nothing. Just think about anonymous comments online. Hidden behind a fake name, someone can insult, lie, or manipulate, and never have to face the moral consequences. Because in anonymity, there's no face. And without a face, there's no guilt, no regret, no confrontation. Kierkegaard is saying, without identity, there is no ethics. And this applies to every part of life. If you refuse to face who you are, if you choose to live with a blurry, undefined identity, then you also refuse to take responsibility for the impact you have on the world. You stop being the author of your life and become a passive object in someone else's story. Against this, Kierkegaard offers a radical path. Reclaim yourself. He never promises it'll be easy. In fact, he's clear. It will hurt. It will bring anxiety. It will be lonely. Because becoming someone real means confronting the emptiness the crowd tries to hide. The true self is born in the silence of inner life. It emerges when you have the courage to look at yourself honestly and say, "This is who I am. And I am responsible for being who I am." That's why Kierkegaard talks so much about our relationship with God, not in a rigid religious sense, but as a symbol of a deep personal confrontation. A space where the self stands fully exposed before the absolute. A self that can't hide, that can't fake it, that must take full responsibility. This is the fight against anonymity, the battle not to lose your soul. Becoming someone has a price. You might be misunderstood. You might be rejected. You'll have to go against the flow, break from what's expected, challenge what's normal. But the alternative is existential death. Dehumanization happens when we settle for being just one more. When we let the system define us, when we live only on the surface, when we stop being real because we're afraid of being rejected. The greatest form of despair is not wanting to be yourself. Kierkegaard. That's why reclaiming your identity isn't some philosophical luxury, it's an existential necessity. The crowd wants you to disappear, to drown in the noise, but you don't have to give in. You can say no to anonymity. You can choose to become someone. You can choose to live a life with a face, with a name, with depth. And that, and only that, is what it means to be truly human. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard gives us a striking image of faith, not as a peaceful shared belief celebrated by everyone, but as a lonely, intense, and paradoxical path. A path that requires silence, courage, and isolation, not from the world itself, but from the crowd that represents it. For Kierkegaard, true faith isn't popular. It doesn't seek approval. It doesn't need to be explained, understood, or validated by others. It takes root deep within the individual, where the self comes face to face with the absolute and becomes responsible for itself before something greater than any social rule: God. Faith begins precisely where thinking ends. Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling. And that's why the path of faith can't be walked as a group. By its very nature, it's personal, incommunicable, unique. The central figure in Fear and Trembling is the patriarch Abraham. God calls him to do something that defies all moral logic: sacrifice his own son, Isaac. Kierkegaard isn't focusing on blind obedience. What he wants to show is the depth of the paradox. Abraham believes that God will give Isaac back to him, even after asking him to give Isaac up. He believes against all logic, against all human ethics, against what anyone would consider reasonable. This is the knight of faith, someone who lives on a level beyond public ethics. He acts with absolute responsibility, but can't explain his actions to others. His commitment is to God, not to the judgment of the crowd. Abraham isn't a hero in the traditional sense. He doesn't save anyone. He doesn't conquer lands. What he does is something more radical. He holds on to his faith in the impossible, alone, misunderstood, and afraid. Abraham believed, by virtue of the absurd, that God wouldn't take Isaac, even though he had demanded it. Fear and Trembling. This requires a kind of strength the crowd doesn't understand, because the crowd wants things to make sense. It wants logic, explanations. But faith, at this level, is a leap. It means letting go of calculations. It means trusting without guarantees. Faith isn't comfort, it's risk. Faith is often sold as a source of peace, protection, or security. But Kierkegaard shows us the opposite. Faith as an extreme existential risk. Faith that separates you from the ordinary. That makes you look crazy. That makes you feel like a stranger even among people you love. There is no authentic faith without anxiety, because faith only matters when there's no certainty, when reason fails, when the ground beneath you disappears, and it's at that point that the crowd walks away from you. The crowd demands clarity, proof, and normality. But faith asks you to stay, even when everything feels absurd. The knight of faith has to choose, and that choice is deeply personal. Kierkegaard insists, no one can believe on your behalf. True faith can't be inherited or taught like a ready-made doctrine. It has to be experienced, lived, and often suffered. There's no manual for this. Abraham had no precedent. He couldn't explain it to Sarah, or to Isaac, or to the servants. He walked with the knife, and with faith, without answers. And that silence is what makes his faith real. There's no performance, no applause, just the broken heart of a man responding to a call that no one else could understand. And that leads to a hard question. Are we willing to live our faith at that level? Or are we just looking for a faith that helps us fit in? Kierkegaard was a strong critic of institutional religion in his time. He saw 19th century Christianity as shallow. People claimed to believe, but lived without risk, without passion, without real transformation. A kind of crowd Christianity, But for him, real Christianity is the opposite of that. It's a personal calling that demands inner change. Going to church, following rituals, repeating beliefs, none of that is enough. Faith must be lived with existential honesty, with anxiety, with real decision. To be a Christian means becoming something completely different. And only you can do that by yourself. Kierkegaard faith, when lived authentically, breaks away from religion that's just about comfort, because it demands sacrifice, responsibility, and a kind of courage that most of us avoid, the courage to believe without proof. The famous image of the leap of faith captures this idea. Faith isn't just a logical next step. It's not the result of a perfect argument. It's a leap, a jump beyond reason, beyond normal morality, beyond human security. And that leap can't be done in a group. It only happens when you're standing alone, face to face with yourself, when there's nothing left to hold on to except trust in something greater. Kierkegaard knew true faith was rare, because it means letting go of what's visible, predictable, and safe, and embracing something sacred and absurd. And that's unbearable for anyone who's still chained to the expectations of the crowd. Still, despite his demanding tone, Kierkegaard isn't saying that faith is impossible. On the contrary, he's saying that it's available to all of us. The leap is there, but we have to stop pretending we can live a true life of faith without paying the price of individuality. There is no faith without letting go, without solitude, without confrontation. The crowd can offer you religion, but it will never offer you real faith. And here's the final paradox. Faith is deeply personal, but when you live it authentically, it connects you to something universal, to the eternal. There's a kind of life that seems free, exciting, full of pleasures and possibilities. A life driven by experiences, by the pursuit of beauty, excitement, and fun. This is the aesthetic life, and Søren Kierkegaard explores it deeply in his book, Either Or. At first glance, it might even look like the ideal way to live. But behind the shine, there's a shadow, and Kierkegaard reveals it with precision. To live aesthetically is to live for the eyes of others. It means existing as a performance, not as a person. It's about building an image that pleases, impresses, seduces, but hides a deep emptiness, a quiet despair growing in the soul. The aesthete is someone who avoids true commitment to life. This way of living isn't just an individual choice anymore. It has become a collective phenomenon, a crowd's aesthetic. We're surrounded by images, idealized lifestyles, daily routines turned into content. Everything carefully crafted to be admired, everything made to be seen. But who is the person behind it all? The aesthete, a slave to pleasure and appearances. In the first volume of Either Or, Kierkegaard presents the aesthete, someone who lives purely on the surface, guided by feelings and appearances. They avoid boredom by constantly chasing entertainment. They dodge anything too serious. They treat every moment like a game. They impress and get impressed, but never really connect. The aesthete is refined, sensitive, creative, but empty. Everything they do is designed to escape the weight of reality. They want to live intensely, but without responsibility. They want to love without pain, experience without commitment, be admired without being truly known. They measure their value not by any truth within themselves, but by how much they impress others. The aesthete despairs because their life is just a collection of fleeting moments, with no unity, no direction. Kierkegaard. This kind of life may look free, but it's actually deeply dependent. The aesthete constantly needs outside approval. They need to be watched. They need to be desired. They need to be noticed. Without that, they fade away. The aesthetic of the crowd. Everyone wants to be seen, but no one wants to be known. Kierkegaard lived in the 19th century, but his critique feels like it was written for today. Aesthetic living isn't just an option anymore. It's almost expected. We live on platforms where everything becomes a picture. where the value of an experience lies more in how it will look when shared than in what it actually means. Pleasure is staged. Happiness is acted out. Identity is shaped around what others expect. In this world, the aesthetic of the crowd takes over, a collective way of being where everyone wants to stand out, but ends up looking the same. Everyone wants to be unique, but follows the same filters, the same trends, the same catchphrases. It's an aesthetic with no soul, originality that comes pre-packaged, freedom that only exists inside an algorithm. And what's the cost of that? Boredom, emptiness, the quiet despair Kierkegaard already warned about. Boredom as a symptom of a sleeping soul. To the aesthete, life must always be interesting. But it's that constant search for pleasure that makes them especially vulnerable to boredom. Not the ordinary kind, but a deep, existential boredom. A kind of soul fatigue. Because a life made only of disconnected experiences, with no roots, no purpose, no truth, eventually burns out. The aesthete is surrounded by everything, yet disconnected from themselves. They've seen it all, done it all, lived it all, but never truly been. And that's when despair shows up. The aesthete senses something is missing, but doesn't know what. So they try to fill the hole with more experiences, more wins, more applause, but nothing works. The aesthete's despair is the despair of not wanting to be oneself. They've become such a polished image that they no longer know where their real self is. They got lost in the gaze of others. And now, when they're alone, they feel a deep terror because the audience is gone and they have no one left to perform for. Kierkegaard doesn't judge the aesthete with moralism. He understands their pain. But he shows that this way of life can't last forever. Sooner or later, the aesthete must make a choice. Either sink deeper into despair or move toward a new way of living. The ethical life. The ethical life, choosing responsibility. Over applause to Kierkegaard, the ethical life is when a person takes full responsibility for their own existence. They stop living to please others and start living in alignment with their inner truth. They stop avoiding suffering and learn to see it as part of growing. They let go of appearances and step into the territory of deep, honest living. But this transformation doesn't come without pain. It demands honesty, brutal self-reflection, and a willingness to face the emptiness inside. It forces a person to confront who they've become and to have the courage to change. Living for the eyes of others is dying to yourself. The crowd's aesthetic is seductive. It promises recognition, belonging, applause. But it's a disguised prison, because the more you live to be looked at, the less you live to be yourself. The modern aesthete is the influencer who lost their identity trying to please everyone. The artist who no longer creates from the soul, just for the algorithm. The everyday person who builds their whole life around being liked, but no longer knows who they are when no one's watching. Kierkegaard challenges us to break free from all of this, to stop living for the show, to stop making the aesthetic life our end goal, to stop performing and finally start living as real human beings. We live in a time where everything feels leveled out. Behaviors, opinions, lifestyles, everything tends to fit into an acceptable, predictable, and shareable mold. This process, which today we call social homogenization, isn't new. Søren Kierkegaard saw it emerging back in the 19th century, and his critique feels more relevant now than ever. In Stages on Life's Way, Kierkegaard presents the idea of life spheres, three fundamental ways of living: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Moving from one sphere to the next isn't just an intellectual shift. It's an existential leap, and it's within the ethical sphere that a person truly begins to become someone. So what defines this ethical sphere? Responsibility. The transition from simply appearing to truly being. The decision to live as a unique individual, accountable to oneself and to God, not just a reflection of the crowd. The ethical person is the one who wants to be a self, and who takes that self seriously before the eternal. Kierkegaard, Stages on Life's Way. And that's where ethics becomes an act of resistance, because choosing to be a responsible individual breaks away from the forces of social homogenization. It's a bold move that challenges the comfort of the crowd and exposes the illusion of a neutral existence. Ethics requires separation. Not everyone can come with you. When someone enters the ethical sphere, they leave behind the mindset of constant comparison. They no longer live by imitation or adaptation. The central question is no longer, what would others do? But what should I do? That's a powerful shift, because social homogenization relies on the idea that everyone should act, feel, and think in roughly the same way. Ethics, on the other hand, demands that you become different, not out of ego, but out of loyalty to your inner duty. Being ethical isn't about being moralistic. It's not about following external rules to appear virtuous. It's about a commitment to the truth of your own existence. It's the decision to stop living on autopilot and start acting with intention, awareness, and responsibility. But that choice comes at a price. The ethical person can no longer hide behind social conventions. They can't use "everyone does it" as a justification. They can't lean on the group for protection. They stand alone, face to face with themselves and with the absolute. Social homogenization doesn't happen by force. Most of the time, it's willingly embraced. Because thinking for yourself is hard. Owning your mistakes is painful. Carrying the full weight of your existence is scary. It's easier to live like everyone else, to make decisions based on what's popular, to follow established norms, to copy what works. This kind of life may feel safe. But for Kierkegaard, it's spiritually empty. Ethics asks for more. It asks you to take your freedom seriously, to recognize that you are always choosing, and that each choice shapes who you are. Responsibility isn't a burden imposed from the outside, but a demand from within the self. Stages on life's way. Ethics, then, isn't some kind of collective morality. It's an internal practice, a continuous commitment to what's just, true, and authentic, even when it goes against the grain. One of the traps of a homogenized life is the need for outside validation. Doing what's acceptable, what's socially praised, what fits the group's expectations. But ethics doesn't care about popularity. The ethical person knows that doing what's right may lead to being misunderstood, rejected, or even in conflict. And still, they keep going. Because their compass doesn't point to others. It points inward. They live by a deeper calling, something more demanding, something that can't be traded away for approval. In the ethical sphere, life is no longer about performing. It's about showing up. The goal is not to seem consistent, but to be consistent with oneself and with what one knows to be true. Social homogenization erases differences. It turns people into profiles, ideas into trends, identities into brands. But ethics, according to Kierkegaard, moves in the opposite direction. It restores the individual's uniqueness. And this uniqueness isn't about surface-level quirks. It's the core of the self that takes responsibility for its own existence. The ethical person doesn't accept being reduced to labels. They don't fit in easily. They live in tension because they've chosen truth over comfort. Ethics is a form of resistance, not reactive resistance, but active presence, a way of living that declares day after day that existence matters, that choices have consequences, and that a human being is more than just a cog in the machine. The self that doesn't recognize itself as responsible is not yet a true self. Kierkegaard. In the ethical sphere, Kierkegaard brings in a new dimension, the relationship with God, but not a distant, institutional, or dogmatic God. Rather, the absolute that calls for radical responsibility. God, in this sense, is the end of comparison. Before him, you can't hide, you can't lie, you can't dodge accountability. It's in this moment of confrontation that ethics reaches its most authentic form. Now, the person isn't just following human moral codes. They're responding to a deeper conscience where the voice of the eternal is written. That voice doesn't shout, it whispers, but it demands everything. To be ethical is to reject dilution. It's to resist becoming just one more. It's to affirm that human life has depth, and that living authentically, justly, and responsibly still matters, even if the world tells you otherwise. That choice isn't easy. It can be lonely, it can be uncomfortable, but it's the only path Kierkegaard sees as worthy of a real human being. Truth is always the path of the individual. Kierkegaard. And the ethical individual, even in silence, even in struggle, even alone, stays standing. Long before the internet, television, or social media existed, Søren Kierkegaard had already identified a dangerous phenomenon growing in modern society: the tyranny of public opinion. An invisible but incredibly powerful force, capable of shaping thoughts, behaviors, and identities without requiring reflection, responsibility, or truth. Kierkegaard saw the 19th century press as the beginning of a new kind of control, not direct political control, but spiritual and existential control, subtle and numbing. To him, public opinion, especially when driven by a media that's not committed to truth, becomes the new crowd, a faceless mass that speaks, judges, and condemns without thinking. The press is the most dangerous tool of depersonalization, paraphrasing Kierkegaard. He believed this power didn't just inform people, it shaped them, or worse, deformed them, turning them into echoes of what's being said rather than into thoughtful individuals. Public opinion doesn't think, it repeats. One of Kierkegaard's sharpest critiques of public opinion is that it doesn't function like real consciousness. It doesn't think, analyze, or take responsibility. It just repeats. Public opinion is, by definition, impersonal. And that's what makes it so dangerous. No one is public opinion, which means no one takes ownership of it. It exists, it acts, it influences, but it has no face, no soul. A person who lets themselves be guided by public opinion no longer asks, "What do I think?" or "What is true?" Instead, they ask, "What's everyone saying?" or "What's okay to say right now?" That's where thinking dies. And when thinking dies, the human being becomes just a mouthpiece for other people's ideas. They stop daring to think differently. And if they do, they quickly back down, afraid of sounding out of touch. Kierkegaard saw it clearly. Public opinion is the crowd disguised as reason. The press as a tool for flattening thought. Kierkegaard wasn't against communication or dialogue. But even in his time, he saw the rise of a kind of press that no longer served truth, but rather entertainment, superficiality, and easy consensus. He accused the media of creating a false sense of participation. People believe they're informed, engaged, and discussing important topics. But in reality, they're just being swept along by a current of ideas that didn't come from them and haven't been truly understood. The press, then, becomes a way of leveling down thought, not by censorship, but by encouraging intellectual laziness. It promotes conformity. It feeds the fear of standing out. The tyranny of public opinion doesn't demand obedience, just that you don't think. Paraphrasing Kierkegaard. This criticism becomes even more disturbing when we look at today's media landscape. Kierkegaard didn't live in the digital age, but his analysis fits perfectly with the behavior of modern social media. Viral ideas with no reflection, instant group judgments, and symbolic public shaming in the name of consensus. The anonymity of the digital crowd. A key point in Kierkegaard's critique of public opinion is its anonymity. The crowd that judges, cancels, applauds, or condemns never has a face. And because of that, no one is held responsible for anything. Today, with the internet, this lack of accountability has only gotten stronger. Anonymous profiles, thoughtless comments, mass cancel culture. It all reflects what Kierkegaard warned about: the destruction of individual responsibility in the name of the collective voice. But he didn't just criticize. He also offered a way forward, a return to responsibility, to inner life, to a truth that doesn't come from group consensus, but from a personal confrontation with existence. Thinking is risky, but essential for Kierkegaard. The only way to escape the tyranny of public opinion is to take the risk of thinking for yourself. That means isolation, anxiety, and even rejection. But it's the only path to an authentic life. Thinking is lonely, and often painful, because you'll have to hold on to ideas the world doesn't understand yet. You'll have to face being called difficult, strange, or inconvenient. But for Kierkegaard, truth always belongs to the individual, never to the crowd. And thinking isn't just about disagreeing. It's about living in your own silence, wrestling with your own conscience, and searching for something beyond appearances. It's stepping out of the information avalanche and asking, what in all of this is actually true? What really matters to me as a human being? These questions don't have answers in the media. They can only be answered in solitude. Kierkegaard's critique is spiritual, not just cultural. When we let public opinion think for us, we're giving up our spirit. We're turning away from what makes us free and responsible. The media, when used without reflection, becomes a substitute for our conscience, a lazy guide for those who don't want to think. And this is exactly what Kierkegaard fought so passionately against: the idea that we can live a spiritual life without doing the hard inner work. The spirit demands inwardness, but public opinion thrives on surface-level thinking. Kierkegaard adapted. The crowd may talk about everything, but it never touches what truly matters. It avoids depth. And a person who gives themselves to the crowd risks being very informed and still completely empty inside. One of Kierkegaard's most powerful insights is this: truth is not popular. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't become a trend. It doesn't reshape itself to please. Truth is demanding. It asks for responsibility. It asks for silence. It asks for courage. And that's why truth needs the individual. Because only the individual can listen deeply, discern wisely, make choices, and live by what they know is true, even if it goes against all the noise around them. True faith is never born from reason, not because it's irrational, but because it goes beyond reason. It begins exactly where arguments fail, where evidence isn't enough, where logic can't reach. That's why, for Søren Kierkegaard, faith requires a leap that only the individual can make, and one the crowd will never understand. Faith begins precisely where thinking ends. Kierkegaard, fear and trembling. The crowd demands explanations. It needs logic, rules, predictability. But faith can't be explained. It has to be lived. It's not something to be debated. It's something to embody. And that's the scandal. To the world, faith looks like madness. It seems absurd, irrational. And yet, for Kierkegaard, that madness is the highest form of human existence. The crowd's logic, predictable, comfortable, limited. Collective reasoning works through consensus. It tries to organize the world into clear categories: right and wrong, allowed and forbidden, reasonable and absurd. It's useful for social, political, and practical decisions, but it never reaches the absolute. The crowd operates in the realm of the general. It thrives on rules, examples, precedents. It wants safety, structure, and everything to fit into something familiar. That's why faith is so disturbing to the crowd, because it breaks that predictability. It doesn't follow the script. It often moves against every rational reason, as Kierkegaard shows through the story of Abraham. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard analyzes the biblical moment when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. The story is shocking. A father is called to do the unthinkable, and he obeys. But Kierkegaard isn't focused on the religious aspect. He's interested in the existential paradox Abraham represents. According to human ethics, Abraham should be condemned. He looks like a fanatic, a lunatic. But before God, he is righteous, because his faith isn't a rejection of reason. It's a surrender to something unconditional, something beyond any rational justification. Abraham acts alone. He doesn't consult anyone. He gives no explanations. He writes no essays. He simply believes. And in that act, he separates himself completely from the crowd, because the crowd would never accept this kind of sacred madness. Abraham believed, by virtue of the absurd, that he would get Isaac back. And fear and trembling, that's the leap, to believe when there's no more certainty, when logic demands surrender, but the heart, moved by faith, keeps going. The leap can't be made as a group. At this level, faith is non-transferable. You can't enter it as part of a group. You can't copy it. There's no formula, no course, no community that can give someone the strength to leap. The leap of faith is always solitary. And that's why Kierkegaard insists. The crowd is the biggest obstacle to real faith. Where there's consensus, there's comfort. And where there's comfort, there's no need to leap. The leap requires anxiety. It requires the risk of the abyss. It demands that the person stand alone in front of the paradox, with no explanations, no guarantees, no audience. It's a total surrender, not to irrationality, but to what lies beyond reason. Faith isn't an argument. It's a movement of the spirit. Kierkegaard's critique of institutional religion. This is exactly where Kierkegaard's critique of institutional religion comes in. He saw the Christianity of his time as a shallow copy, a socially accepted faith, tame, repeated in words but empty of real depth. To him, that kind of faith doesn't require a leap. It just requires conformity. And because of that, it's false. It doesn't transform. It doesn't demand courage. It simply maintains the status quo. Authentic faith, on the other hand, is always a risk. It's always a rupture. It's always a path that goes unnoticed by the crowd. That's why it can't be taught as a doctrine. It can only be lived. Faith is the highest passion in a human being, and only the individual can have it. Kierkegaard. Faith isn't certainty, it's trust. What Kierkegaard calls faith is not the same as certainty. Certainty belongs to reason. It needs proof, evidence. Faith doesn't. It's a kind of trust that jumps into the unknown. It doesn't say, I'm sure this will work, but rather, I'm all in, even if I don't understand. This kind of faith can't be created by social pressure. It can't come from tradition or culture. It always grows out of an inner crisis, a calling, something that breaks the routine of life. And whoever answers that call enters a new dimension of existence, one where the logic of the crowd no longer applies. Kierkegaard isn't saying reason has no value. Far from it. He was a deeply rational thinker. What he's saying is that there are moments in life when reason must be transcended, not denied, but surpassed by something deeper. Faith as a personal relationship with the absolute. And this leap isn't just theological, it's existential. It's the moment when someone finally becomes a self in the face of the eternal. They stop depending on other people's opinions, external guarantees, or social formulas. They commit to something only they can live. This is the birth of true interiority, the emergence of the authentic self, no longer defined by the crowd, but grounded in faith. To the world, the leap of faith may look like madness, but Kierkegaard calls it sacred madness, the kind of courage that transcends what's normal to touch the mystery. It's not superstition. It's not blind irrationality. It's a radical inner decision that breaks with the logic of the masses. That's why faith will never be fully understood. It won't be explained, but it will be lived, and that lived experience is what transforms a person. The word anxiety usually makes us uncomfortable. It's seen as something we should avoid, fix, or cure. But for Søren Kierkegaard, one of the greatest existential thinkers in history, anxiety isn't a flaw in life. It's proof that we're truly alive. In his work, The Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard invites us to face this feeling most people run from, He offers a radical idea. Anxiety is the price of freedom. And more than that, it's its strongest sign. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Beat Kierkegaard, the concept of anxiety. This means only someone who's free can feel anxiety. It happens when you realize that you're responsible for your own choices. When you see that your life isn't built on ready-made formulas, but is something you have to shape yourself. And that naturally is scary. The crowd runs from anxiety. In everyday life, anxiety is treated like something we should get rid of. People see it as a sign of weakness, indecision, or instability. That's why many cling to routines, external rules, and popular opinions. Not because they truly believe in them, but because they offer an escape from the anxiety of choosing. The crowd is this collective escape. It tells you what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable. It hands you a ready-made morality, a safe path, a mass-produced identity. And when you hold on to that, you get a break from the pain of choosing on your own. You trade your freedom for a sense of stability. But Kierkegaard says that trade comes with a steep cost, the loss of your authenticity. Anxiety is the possibility of freedom. Kierkegaard. Avoiding anxiety means avoiding your own freedom. You start to live passively, reacting to life instead of actively creating your path. Freedom means possibility, and that scary Kierkegaard doesn't see freedom as some abstract idea. It's something real, something you feel deep inside. To be free is to live with possibilities. That's both amazing and terrifying. Because every choice means giving something else up. Every decision you make closes the door on other paths. And most importantly, no one can choose for you. That's where anxiety comes in. It shows up when you realize you're the one who has to decide who you'll be. There are no guarantees, no guidebooks, just you and your freedom. That's the dizziness, the overwhelming awareness that you could either rise or fall. That's the weight of an authentic life, the myth of a life without anxiety. A lot of people try to get rid of anxiety by chasing a safe life, the right job, the perfect relationship, the secure plan. But behind that search is often a fear of choosing. Kierkegaard reminds us, there's no real life without anxiety, because there's no freedom without risk. Trying to eliminate anxiety is really just trying to eliminate freedom, and that's exactly what the crowd offers. A life model with no real freedom. You just follow the script. You copy behaviors. You echo beliefs, and that's why you stop feeling anxiety, because you've stopped feeling yourself. But this escape is an illusion. Anxiety doesn't disappear, it just hides. And later, it comes back as boredom, frustration, or that vague feeling that you're living a life that doesn't belong to you. Anxiety as the voice of the true self. To Kierkegaard, feeling anxiety means you're getting closer to your real self. Because anxiety only shows up when you start waking up to your own freedom and responsibility. In that open space of possibilities, something shifts. You begin to see that you're more than your job, more than your social role, more than your looks. You're a being capable of choosing, creating, and changing. But that kind of realization doesn't come without pain. Anxiety is like the labor pains of the true self. It comes before the decision. It's the bridge between the old self, shaped by the crowd, and the new self, built through freedom. Man is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of possibility and necessity. Kierkegaard. Anxiety reveals that synthesis. It's the place where the eternal meets the temporary, where what could be challenges what is, and that's sacred, even if it's frightening. Don't run from it, stay with it. Kierkegaard's biggest proposal is this: don't run from anxiety, stay with it. Sit in that uncomfortable place where there are no easy answers. because that's where freedom starts to feel real. Most people prefer to run. They chase distractions, bury themselves in busyness, or adopt other people's opinions. But the path of authenticity asks for something else: courage, the willingness to look within, even when what you see is uncertain. In that sense, anxiety is your ally. It's the alarm clock of the soul, a signal that there's something you need to face, a decision to make, a life waiting to be lived more truthfully. Anxiety is the exercise of freedom, idea adapted from Kierkegaard. And so, what seemed like something negative becomes a doorway to growth. Freedom brings anxiety, but also sets you free. Feeling anxiety doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're aware. It means you're awake. It means you're standing face to face with the choice to fully exist. The crowd will tell you that feeling this way is weakness, that it's better to blend in, smile, and move on. But Kierkegaard suggests the opposite. Listen to your anxiety. It's telling you there's something more, that you're not just another number, that you can be yourself, but it takes a choice. Anxiety is the beginning of freedom. Don't run from it. Use it. Let it push you. Let it wake you up. Let it invite you. And maybe, for the first time, you'll start to live, not the life the crowd wants, but the one your soul demands. The hostility of the crowd doesn't always show up as open hatred or violence. Sometimes it's much more subtle. It shows up as envy, a quiet, collective envy, masked by sarcasm, passive-aggressive jokes, or cold indifference. It's the kind of envy that can't stand someone else's light, because that light reveals the darkness in those who refuse to live with depth. Søren Kierkegaard, reflecting on Danish society in his time, was one of the first to clearly name this phenomenon. The crowd, that impersonal, leveling force, cannot tolerate anyone who dares to stand out. It's irritated by those who think for themselves, live authentically, or burn with intensity. The individual who wants to be himself immediately becomes the target of the crowd's anger. Kierkegaard. And that anger is rarely loud. Most of the time, it's disguised envy. It's the crowd's way of protecting its comfortable mediocrity by dragging everything down to the same level. It's like saying, if you stand out, you make us look at ourselves. And we don't want that. We just want to stay where we are. Envy as a defense of normality. To Kierkegaard, modern society builds a structure where everyone is supposed to be more or less the same, in opinions, desires, and ambitions. Real difference, rare talent, existential courage. These things make people uncomfortable, not because they're bad, but because they force others to face themselves. The authentic individual becomes a mirror that reflects how most people are just surviving, repeating, conforming. That's why anyone who stands out is often mocked, diminished, or simply ignored. Not with force, but with mockery, with irony, with strategic indifference. That's where envy becomes a social weapon, a way to keep the group comfortable in its own mediocrity. The envied person becomes a threat just by existing. Kierkegaard adapted. The light of someone living authentically doesn't have to be arrogant to make people uneasy. Just their presence is enough to disturb those who live on autopilot. Dragging everyone down. Social leveling, as Kierkegaard already warned, isn't just a loss of diversity, it's an unconscious survival strategy, a way for the collective to protect itself from the exceptional. The crowd prefers everyone to be more or less good, more or less aware, more or less the same. Because that way, no one stands out. No one causes discomfort. No one demands a deeper ethical or existential effort from anyone else. Anyone who rises morally, spiritually, or intellectually breaks that silent agreement. And so, they must be pulled back down, through criticism, mockery, exclusion, or silence. What Kierkegaard pointed out is something we still see today. The culture of, don't act like you're better than us, or, who do you think you are? Society feels the need to keep individuals within acceptable limits, not out of fairness, but out of envy. Authentic living is a threat. Anyone who chooses to live with depth, who refuses the crowd's hypocrisy, will eventually become a target. Not because they did anything wrong, but because by simply being themselves, they expose the conformity of others. Kierkegaard knew this all too well. He was harshly criticized in his time, not for doing anything immoral, but for daring to think differently. His writing made people uncomfortable. His presence unsettled them. He wasn't one of us, and because of that, he became the target of the press, public mockery, and social rejection. The crowd is more forgiving of the public sinner than of the authentic individual. Kierkegaard, paraphrased. That reveals an uncomfortable truth. Society is quicker to forgive obvious mistakes than quiet excellence. Because mistakes don't challenge the system, but authenticity does. Envy as cowardice. Kierkegaard saw collective envy as fear in disguise. Fear of change, fear of thinking, fear of taking responsibility. The crowd envies those who stand out because deep down they know they could be more, but chose not to be. And when they see someone who had the courage to be more, they feel the sting of their own inaction. Envy becomes a way of attacking what they know they should be pursuing, but didn't have the strength to go after. It's a defense mechanism, but a toxic one, for both the envier and the one being envied. The envious become prisoners of what they're too afraid to be, and the envied are often pushed into isolation, not because they want it, but because the crowd can't stand their presence. The courage to resist mediocrity. Kierkegaard's message, as always, is not comfortable. He challenges us to become more, and that means facing the discomfort of being envied. If you choose to live authentically, think deeply, and act with integrity, you will be misunderstood. You will be rejected. You will be criticized, because the world is not ready for people who live with intensity. But Kierkegaard insists it's worth it, because the alternative is worse, being accepted at the cost of your own truth, being just one more in a sea of conformity, giving up your soul for the sake of social peace that's really just silent compromise. Become who you are. Kierkegaard. That calling includes facing loneliness, criticism, and yes, envy. But it also includes the deep joy of living truthfully, with purpose, and with freedom. The crowd may hate you, but you don't have to hate yourself. The worst part of collective envy isn't what others think of you. It's when it convinces you to give up on yourself, when you start doubting your worth, hiding your talents, and dimming your light just to avoid making others uncomfortable. Kierkegaard warns, that's existential death. You can disturb the crowd and still live a meaningful life. But if you try to please everyone, you'll lose what truly matters, your soul. Few words make people today as uncomfortable as this one: solitude. In a world that constantly pushes us to connect, to be seen, to belong instantly, being alone feels like failure, like lack, like something's wrong. But for Søren Kierkegaard, solitude is the exact opposite. It's the necessary condition to find what's most real inside us. Throughout all his work, from either or to fear and trembling, the sickness unto death to the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard returns to a single core idea. Authentic existence begins in silence, and it's only possible in solitude, because it's only when a person is truly alone, away from the crowd, stripped of all social masks, that they can look at themselves with no distractions, no excuses, and no applause. The individual's highest task is to become themselves before God, and that can only happen in solitude. Kierkegaard, paraphrased. This solitude isn't about social isolation. It's an existential state, a stepping away from external noise so the inner voice can finally be heard. The crowd blocks the path to the self. The crowd, a constant theme in Kierkegaard's writing, stands for everything external, impersonal, and flattening. It shapes opinions, sets the rules, hands you a ready-made identity. And by doing so, it interrupts the deepest movement of spiritual life, the return to oneself. It's impossible to truly find yourself when you're always exposed to other people's opinions, guided by what's popular, adapting to collective expectations. The crowd offers comfort, but it steals depth. It shields us from the pain of being alone, but it also keeps us from making the only move that truly transforms, diving inward. Being alone, in this sense, is not a punishment. It's a calling. A call to the hardest and most necessary confrontation of all, the one with who you really are. Solitude as a mirror of the true self. As long as we're surrounded by distractions, by voices, by social obligations, we can keep putting that confrontation off. We pretend to be who others expect. We repeat what we're told. We hide behind the role we've learned to play. But when everything goes quiet, when there's no one watching, applauding, or judging, there's only one person left, ourselves. That's the moment Kierkegaard sees as the birthplace of authenticity, when the self stops being defined from the outside and starts asking inward questions, when they're no longer just one more in the crowd, but begin to wonder, who am I? What am I doing with my life? Who do I need to be true to? Solitude is the laboratory where the soul meets the eternal. Or Kierkegaard, adapted. That meeting isn't easy. It can be terrifying. There are no guarantees, no quick answers. But that's exactly why it's real. It demands responsibility. It demands truth. It demands silence. Noise as a form of escape. Kierkegaard saw in modern society a growing addiction to noise. Empty talk, repetitive habits, endless entertainment. All of it as a way to escape the discomfort of being alone. Today, that's even more intense. We're surrounded by stimuli. With a single tap, we can run from ourselves. We can fill the void with content, notifications, screens. But Kierkegaard would warn us. The more we run from solitude, the further we drift from who we are. And the further we drift from ourselves, the more we suffer inside, with misunderstood anxiety, deep boredom, and a constant feeling of being disconnected. That's why he suggests we flip the script. Don't run from solitude. Embrace it as a path of listening, of maturing, of meeting yourself and God. A relationship with God only happens one-on-one. For Kierkegaard, the relationship with God isn't collective. It doesn't go through institutions. It's personal, intimate, direct. It's the individual, alone, standing before the eternal. This kind of encounter needs silence, and it needs courage, because in Kierkegaard's view, God isn't just comfort, he's also challenge. He calls the individual to truth, and truth is never soft, never neutral, never decided by a group. Faith, then, doesn't grow in a crowd. It's not built in a group. It's born in the solitude of a heart that honestly asks what its place is in this world. And meeting the divine is also meeting the self. Because when you stand before God, you see yourself more clearly. You see your freedom, your responsibility, your emptiness, and your possibility. Truth is always the truth of the individual, a Kierkegaard. And truth only reveals itself in the silence of solitude. Solitude is not the end. It's the beginning. It's important to be clear. Kierkegaard isn't preaching solitude as an escape from the world. He sees it as a starting point for living in the world, but living authentically. After finding themselves in solitude, the person returns to life transformed. They no longer act by imitation, but with conviction. They no longer bend to the crowd because they know who they are. They don't live to please. They live to fulfill a deeper task. This solitude becomes like a desert out of which a new humanity is born. Not a bitter, resentful, isolated kind of solitude, but a fertile one, full of meaning, creative silence, and true presence. Those who pass through it carry something sacred, a center, a voice, a truth. In a world that constantly pushes us outward, Kierkegaard invites us to do the opposite, to turn inward, to dwell in solitude not as absence, but as space, a space for reconnection, for listening, for rebirth. The crowd shouts, solitude whispers, and in that whisper, the true self begins to form. For most people, being a Christian seems pretty straightforward. Go to church, take part in traditions, follow some customs, live with good values. That's the public, social, and respectable image of Christianity. But for Søren Kierkegaard, that image is an illusion, a deep distortion of what it really means to follow Christ. In Practicing Christianity, one of his most radical works, Kierkegaard dismantles the comfortable Christianity of his time and replaces it with something far more demanding. A lonely path marked by suffering, rejection, and deep existential struggle. Christianity has become too easy to be true. Søren Kierkegaard. The question he asks is harsh but necessary. Are you truly following Christ, or just part of the crowd admiring him from a distance? Kierkegaard begins his critique by reminding us of a crucial fact that people often forget. Christ was rejected. He wasn't celebrated. He wasn't welcomed. He was betrayed, humiliated, and crucified. So if Christ, the very model of Christianity, was rejected by the world, how could a true Christian be accepted by that same world without contradiction? That's the wound Kierkegaard exposes. Real Christianity can't be comfortable or popular because it demands something the crowd refuses to accept. Embodied truth. A life aligned not with convenience, but with eternity. A life of radical surrender, unconditional love, and faith without guarantees. And that kind of life is always going to be scandalous. To follow Christ is to become like him in suffering and rejection. Practice in Christianity. For Kierkegaard, authentic Christianity is a call to existential marginalization. It's not about power, it's about the cross. Not about glory, but about silence. Not about applause, but about renunciation. Faith isn't belief, it's imitation. In Kierkegaard's view, there's a huge difference between believing in Christ and following Christ. Believing is easy. It's about agreeing with ideas, repeating doctrines, accepting dogmas. But following requires existence. It means shaping your entire life around the living Christ. And that's the opposite of mechanical, superficial religion. For Kierkegaard, Christian faith isn't an idea to agree with, it's a way of life to imitate. And imitating Christ isn't symbolic, it's real. It means carrying your own cross, confronting the world, loving your enemies, living in truth even when it costs you everything. To be a Christian is to be crucified with Christ, not just to admire him. Kierkegaard, paraphrased. That's why real faith is a lonely journey, because no one can imitate Christ for you. No one can suffer for you. No one can live your faith in your place. The illusion of social Christianity. Kierkegaard sharply criticizes what he calls Christendom, a society that calls itself Christian but lives in total contradiction to Christ's teachings. He points to churches full of rituals, beautiful words, and respectable members, but empty of authenticity. A version of Christianity molded to fit middle-class comfort, social acceptance, and easy stability. But the Christ of the Gospels wasn't respectable. He wasn't convenient. He confronted religious leaders, welcomed outcasts, and challenged the values of his time, and it cost him his life. To follow him means accepting that you'll also be rejected, questioned, and out of place. And Kierkegaard says it clearly. If your Christianity is comfortable, it isn't Christianity. The call to the individual for Kierkegaard, faith never happens in a crowd. It's not collective. It's always personal. God doesn't speak to the masses. He speaks to the individual, alone, in silence, in inner struggle. So real Christianity isn't about belonging to a group. It's an existential journey inward. This solitude isn't about pride or arrogance, but about the natural consequence of taking faith seriously. Because the more committed you are to the truth of Christ, the more separated you become from the logic of the world. The individual before God, that is the highest form of existence. A Kierkegaard. In the crowd, faith becomes appearance. In solitude, it becomes truth. Suffering as a mark of authenticity. For Kierkegaard, suffering isn't a flaw in the Christian life, it's proof of its truth. Christ suffered, and those who truly follow him will suffer too. Not just the normal pain of life, but the suffering that comes from going against the grain, staying true, and refusing the comfortable lie of shallow religion. This suffering isn't something we seek, but it's something we can't avoid. Because living with truth always provokes resistance. A world addicted to stability can't stand a person living with radical spiritual integrity. That's why a true Christian doesn't adapt to the world in the name of faith, but resists the world out of faithfulness to Christ. The invisible cross of everyday life. We often imagine martyrdom as something big and heroic, but Kierkegaard reminds us that real martyrdom can be quiet, daily, and invisible. It's in the hard choice, the ethical decision, the impossible forgiveness, the quiet surrender. It's in loving without being noticed, hoping without being praised, staying faithful even when no one sees. That's the Christian path, a cross carried in the heart, a life of giving, even when the world doesn't understand, support, or recognize you. To be a Christian is to live the paradox, die to the world, to live for God. Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard doesn't write to condemn, he writes to wake us up, to remind us that Christianity isn't a social identity, but a radical calling, and that calling still echoes today. To be a Christian, in the deepest sense, is to answer that call, not with words, but with your life, not with appearances, but with action, not with safety, but with faith. And that answer will never be collective. It will always be solitary, personal, non-transferable, but also profoundly transformative. In a world that values speed, superficiality, and everything disposable, taking a moment to reflect deeply, to face existential questions, to search for meaning and authenticity, that's an act of courage. And Kierkegaard would be grateful for your presence here, and so am I. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. If this content moved you in any way, give it a like. It really helps spread the message to more people who might need to hear this too. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking this path of thought, awareness, and transformation together. Here, philosophy isn't just theory, it's a way of life. And more videos are coming, always with deep, thought-provoking, and relevant topics for anyone who wants to live with more truth. I also invite you to share this video with someone who might be going through an existential crisis, or who's searching for answers to questions that don't always find space in everyday conversations. It might be exactly what they need right now. And of course, drop a comment below. Which of Kierkegaard's ideas challenged you the most today? Have you ever felt suffocated by the crowd? Have you ever had the courage to live your faith or your truth in silence, even if it meant being rejected? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't leave just yet. There are more videos on this channel that can take you even deeper into this philosophical journey. Stick around, because thinking is also a way to set yourself free. See you in the next video. And remember, existence is a task, and only you can fulfill it.